Hello, World History 1 students. This is Mr. Everton, and this is a video all about Roman society. We're also going to talk a little bit about religion. We're going to try to answer this question: how did social classes and religion affect Roman life? We'll go ahead and get started right away. I'm going to start off by talking about Roman religion, which was adapted from Greek mythology. If you know much about Greek mythology, you might already know this. If you don't know it already, that's fine. Remember, we talked about Greek polytheism in our Greece unit. Polytheism means many gods, right? If you believe in many gods, you're polytheistic. And the Greeks believed in many different gods, and they thought that those gods were responsible for different aspects of nature and human behavior. So the Romans were heavily influenced by the Greeks, who spread throughout the Mediterranean, buying and selling things, engaging in trade, as it were. And when they did that, they exposed the Romans to their religious beliefs, and those religious beliefs were adapted by the Romans. So when we talk about Roman religion, we're usually talking about a lot of the same gods and goddesses from Greek mythology, but we're just using different names. So same god, same goddess, same general responsibilities, different names. So make sure that you write these down in your notes. The Greek god, Zeus, remember, was responsible for, he was the god of the sky, the god of thunder and lightning. He was the king of the gods. The Romans are going to call him Jupiter. Same god, different name. The queen of the gods in Greece was Hera, and she was responsible for marriage and childbirth. The Romans are going to call her Juno. Juno. I went a little fast. The patron goddess of Athens was Athena, the goddess of wisdom. She was also responsible for crafts and some aspects of war. And the Romans will adapt her as well and call her Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom. Here holding an owl. The Greek goddess of love and beauty was Aphrodite. Here she is pictured rising from the sea foam. The Romans would adapt her too, and they would call her Venus. I keep going fast, I'm sorry. And then there is the Greek goddess Artemis, who is the goddess of hunting and the moon. She will be adapted and turned into Diana. You can see pictured here in a Roman sculpture. And then finally, we talked about the Greek god of the sun and music, Apollo. And Apollo will become Apollo because he's the only one that stays the same, doesn't change his name. So he's easy. All the other ones, you have to learn a new name. So sorry about that. Roman mythology has been very influential, as Greek mythology has been. The planets of the solar system are named after Roman gods and goddesses, like Jupiter, the planet, named after Jupiter, the god. Venus, also named after a Roman god. And you don't have to know Mars and Mercury and Neptune and Pluto, but those are all Roman gods as well. Saturn, Uranus, what have you. So there is, just like with Greek mythology, there is a modern influence. There's an influence on Western culture, and by Western culture, I mean Europe and America in particular. Here you can see a painting by the Renaissance artist Sandro Botticelli, The Birth of Venus. This is an illustration of a Roman myth. So know the names of the Roman gods and goddesses. Their effect on Roman life was considerable. People in ancient Rome were very... they would believe in different Roman gods and goddesses and pray to them and make sacrifices and ask them to take care of different problems that they had, just like the Greeks would do with Greek gods and goddesses. I want to shift the majority of the video, though, into talking about Roman society, which was divided into two major groups, two large classes. You can see them pictured here: patricians on the top and plebeians on the bottom. Just like we've seen throughout our class, pyramids tend to be how we depict class systems, with the fewer on the top and the larger number on the bottom. In this instance, the top they're called the patricians. They're the Roman nobility. These are the wealthy elite of the Roman society. These are the people who own the money, who own the land, and who for most of Rome's history dominate Roman government and really control the decisions that are made in Roman society. Below them are the plebeians, and the plebeians are the lower classes. Now, there are plebeians who have a fair amount of money, but if you're a plebeian and you acquire a lot of money, you don't immediately get to just move up into the patrician class. The fact that you were born a plebeian still means that you will die a plebeian, and you won't marry a patrician wife or a patrician husband. You will stay and marry in your own class. And for a long time, the plebeians made up most of Roman society, and for a long time they did not have much influence on Roman politics. It was only gradually that the plebeians were able to protest and make demands that that they have a greater voice in Roman society and that they be more represented. We will talk about this in our next video. Now I want to talk about Roman slavery. The Romans, like the Greeks, were two of the most, that's not the right way to phrase it. The Romans and the Greeks owned lots of slaves. Slavery was widespread in the ancient world, but the Romans and Greeks owned more slaves than most of the other ancient societies that we've been talking about, particularly the Romans. Slaves were the lowest level of Roman society. Slaves were owned as property. They could be bought and sold. Sometimes they were freed. Mostly they weren't. They could be taken, as we've talked about this throughout our class, but they would be taken prisoners of war. Rome was a society that was constantly fighting wars and trying to expand and take over other places. Whenever that would happen, one of the ways that soldiers would get paid would be to capture some people and then sell them into slavery. And that was like considered a legit way for a soldier to increase their pay. Another way that Roman slavery took place was that if like a plebeian couldn't pay their debts, they would be sold into slavery to pay their debts. Also, Romans had a thing they would do where they would expose unwanted babies. They would take them out and just leave them in the woods or leave them on a mountainside. And so if you found an exposed baby that wasn't wanted, you could just claim that child, take care of it, feed it, give it all of its needs, and that child would then legally belong to you, and you could make that child your slave as well. I know, it's messed up. It sounds terrible. I want to talk briefly about the Roman family before we close this video out. Much as other societies we've talked about, Rome was what we call a patriarchy, or a male-dominated society. They weren't as heavily male-dominated as ancient Athens was. They were still very heavily male-dominated. So Roman women weren't like confined to the house the way that Athenian women were confined. They were allowed to go out and do things, but they had very few rights. They had very little control over their lives. They basically, first they belonged to their father, and then when they got married, their rights were transferred over to their husband, and they belonged to him. The paterfamilias is Latin for the head of the household, and this is the oldest man in the household, and he would run the household, and he, according to Roman law, had complete control over everyone in his family, his children, his wife, anybody who lived in the household. Basically, he could do anything he wanted, including having them killed. That wasn't common. That wasn't like a thing that they would do. But like, imagine if you knew that your dad could, like, you know, like like the worst, like you're getting bad grades at school, and like maybe now your parents would take your cell phone. Imagine if your dad was able to kill you. Like that. Gee. All right. So there were very limited rights for women. Women were not able to really own property for a long time in ancient Rome. Eventually that would change. Eventually the paterfamilias would lose some of their complete control over the Roman family. But for much of Roman history, that is the way that it was. So to summarize, we talked about Roman society. We talked about patricians and plebeians. We talked about slavery, which was particularly widespread in Rome and an important part of their economy. We talked about the patriarchy, how the Roman family was dominated by the man. And we talked briefly about Roman religion, how it was influenced by Greek mythology, and how it has had an effect on modern culture and modern literature. Thanks very much for watching, and I will talk to you next time.